I always believed that family bonds were built on care, protection, and belonging to something greater than ourselves. I grew up under the watchful eyes of Helen and George, my parents, who always strove to create a harmonious environment, even if that meant concealing truths that could shatter the peace they had established. Throughout my childhood, I absorbed the notion that love was conditional upon predetermined behaviors, where recognition was granted only to certain family members. The solidity of shared moments coexisted with the shadow of a covert favoritism that silently marked the differences between my siblings, Ryan and Marianne, and me, Beatrice. I always felt as though my feelings and accomplishments were valued less, relegated to a secondary status compared to those who, in my parents' eyes, were naturally destined for greatness because of the way they acted or the ease with which they fit into the family narrative they had built over the years. That fateful evening, during a family dinner at the home built upon traditions and generations of stories, I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by memories of a childhood in which the sense of invisibility was more present than the expectation of unconditional love. The table was already set with heirloom china that had belonged to my grandparents, a silent symbol of the values that were meant to unite the family, yet which would soon become the stage for an unexpected and cruel revelation. Amid the red, wine glasses, and the discreet clinking of tumblers during the meal, the silence, initially comforting and routine, was shattered by words that seemed to have been extracted from a merciless script. My father, with a cold, measured voice, announced without ceremony or regard for the feelings of those gathered that the decision regarding the house, our home, the symbol of both our happiest moments and the struggles we had faced together, had been made months ago. His words resonated with surgical precision, stripping away a reality in which dialogue had been replaced by cold calculations and pragmatic conveniences. Helen, my mother, attempted to ease the tension by explaining that the decision was based on years of investment, the preservation of the family legacy, and a supposed alignment of values with the one designated as the natural heir. Yet to me, Beatrice, those justifications sounded distant and mechanical, as if feelings and belonging did not count when measured against numbers and spreadsheets long hidden in the house's drawers. In that very moment, the sensation of being invisible and devalued intensified, as every word confirmed that the house, so laden with memories, both sweet and bitter, would be awarded to Ryan on the pretext that he possessed the responsibility and alignment with the values our parents had always preached. As dinner progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged with the tension of unveiled secrets and a truth that, for a long time, I had suspected but never allowed my heart to prepare for. The conversation, which had earlier revolved around everyday matters, transformed into a dialogue of justifications that highlighted our parents' arbitrary power in deciding the fate of something as essential as our very home, the identity that dwelled within those walls. In every word, I could hear the muffled sound of my own defenses being crushed by the unquestionable authority of a tradition that disregarded individual will. The memories of moments when I was ignored, when my feelings were set aside, surfaced, with a painful intensity that tested the resilience I had silently nurtured over the years. That dinner's revelation instantly sparked a series of intense reflections on my own identity and on the value I held, regardless of family impositions. In that moment, I discovered an uncontrollable desire to fight for what was rightfully mine, a will to reclaim my voice and rewrite the narrative that had always been constructed to render me a passive spectator in family events. I recalled the documents I had accidentally discovered hidden away, irrefutable evidence of the calculations and spreadsheets that determined the division of our inheritance in an inhuman, dialogueless manner. Every page of those papers was a reminder that the decision on who would keep the house had never been fairly discussed, but rather imposed by arbitrary criteria that blatantly concealed favoritism. From that dinner on, the sense of betrayal became a catalyst for a new phase in my life, one in which the struggle for recognition became indispensable. I realized that when family bonds are treated as mere financial transactions and investment calculations, they lose the intrinsic value they might have if dialogue and love were truly the priorities. That internal transformation struck me like a call to ensure that unilateral decisions would not define the course of my existence or erase my identity. The revelation, which at first glance seemed to confirm the superiority of certain members, awakened in me the conviction that the value of a home goes far beyond what any calculation can measure. It reflects the moments we live, our struggles, our love, and our ability to transform pain into strength. While the looks exchanged among those present desperately tried to normalize the situation, my mind swirled with thoughts of justice, autonomy, and the need to recognize my own truth. Every justification from my parents, every explanation that sounded hollow and rehearsed, reinforced the perception that the house, intended to be a space of memory and belonging, was being converted into a symbol of a historical favoritism that had always excluded me. An unwavering decision emerged. I would not allow this decision to define my role in the family or the unfolding of my own story. It was as if a fog had finally lifted from my eyes, brutally revealing what had always been in plain sight. So, that's it, I thought bitterly. As I pushed away the plate in front of me, my appetite completely vanished. All that talk about equality and justice was just a pretty facade to hide the preferences that always existed. My mother, sensing my discomfort, tried to ease the situation with that conciliatory tone so familiar and equally infuriating to me. "Beatrice, dear, you have to understand that this decision was made with everyone's best interests in mind. Ryan has a family to support," and I interrupted her with a firm gesture, something I had never done before. "Spare me your justifications, Mom. So suddenly, are my life choices disqualifying me from inheriting something that was also built with our grandmother's sacrifices?" My voice emerged more controlled than I expected, despite the turmoil swirling within me. "It's fascinating how you managed to dress up favoritism in such fine clothes of rationality and family concern." Ryan, ever so confident in his privileged position, interjected with the same condescension he always used when speaking to me. "B, don't be so dramatic. Dad and Mom are just being practical. You know I've always been more connected to the house. More what, Ryan? More deserving? More of a son?" I cut in, feeling an unexpected satisfaction as I saw his face blanch. "Please, go on. I'm curious to know what objective criteria qualify you as the natural heir. Is it because you never question anything? Because you always follow the safe, approved path? Or is it simply because you were born the right gender?" A heavy silence fell over the table. My father cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken. It was the first time I had confronted them so directly, and I could feel the palpable shock in the air. For years, I had swallowed my objections, accepting the crumbs of attention and recognition tossed my way. No more. "Do you know what's truly ironic?" I continued, no longer caring about the unspoken family protocol of not discussing serious matters during meals. I spent my whole life trying to prove my worth in this family, believing that if I worked hard enough, one day I would be seen as equal. How naive of me. The decision had been made long before this dinner, probably long before any of us were old enough to understand what was at stake. I pushed my chair back and stood up, feeling an unusual lightness. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders, the weight of trying to belong to a place where there was never truly space for me. "Thank you for the revelatory dinner. At least now I no longer have to delude myself." In the days following that night, I sank into a reflective silence that I hardly recognized in myself. My mother's incessant phone calls were answered with polite, yet distant monosyllables. There was no more room for pretense or concessions. Childhood memories, once tinted with hope, now appeared in a raw and honest light. I remembered how I had been excluded from important decisions, how my dreams were always dismissed as passing phases, while Ryan's were treated as lifelong projects worthy of investment and support. It was almost comical to realize how naive I had been. For years, I believed that if I proved my worth, if I achieved professional recognition, if I built a stable life on my own, something Ryan could never do without our parents' constant financial support, I would finally be seen as equal. But the truth, now crystal clear, was that there had never been a fair competition to begin with. The winner had been chosen from the start. One particularly cold morning, while organizing some old documents I had brought from my parents' house, years ago I found a yellowed photograph. In it, a much younger version of my mother smiled beside her own mother, my grandmother Caroline. The irony was not lost on me. Caroline, who had built a considerable estate in a time when women rarely had financial independence, and who had explicitly declared in her will that the house should be divided equally among her grandchildren, a wish conveniently forgotten by my parents. With the photograph still in my hand, I made a decision that would change the course of events. It was time to consult a lawyer, not out of greed or a desire for revenge, but for justice, not just for me, but for the legacy of a woman who, like me, had probably had to fight against limited expectations and prejudices embedded in family traditions. Dr. Martin's office was exactly as I imagined a family law specialist's practice would be: sober, discreet, with that air of confidentiality that immediately put clients at ease. I explained my situation without beating around the bush, presenting the documents I had found, including a copy of my grandmother's will, which, by some miracle, was among the papers I had brought with me. "Miss Beatrice, from what I see, you have a very strong case," he said, after carefully examining each document. "Your grandmother's expressed wish is clear regarding the equal division of the assets, including the house. Your parents had no legal right to redefine that distribution without the explicit consent of all heirs. And what happens now?" I asked, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. "We can file a lawsuit contesting the decision. It will be a process that could shake the very foundations of your family. You understand that, don't you?" I smiled with a certainty I didn't fully feel yet, a budding assurance that was beginning to grow within me. "Doctor, these foundations have been rotten for a long time. Perhaps it's time to build something new on fairer grounds." A judicial notice arrived at my parents' home on a Wednesday. I learned of it not from them, but from Marianne, my sister, who had always occupied an ambiguous space in our family dynamic, not completely favored like Ryan, nor systematically ignored like me. She called as soon as she found out, her voice wavering between surprise and a reluctant sort of admiration. "Beatrice, did you really go through with it? Dad is distraught. Mom won't stop crying. And Ryan is threatening to cut off all ties with you. And you, Marianne, what do you think of all this?" I asked, genuinely curious where my sister would stand in this battle that was finally coming to light. A prolonged silence preceded her response. "I think you're right," she finally said with a heavy sigh. "I always knew something was off in the way they treated you, but it was easier to pretend I didn't. See it, I'm sorry for that." That small admission, a belated but sincere acknowledgement, sparked a glimmer of hope I didn't know still existed. Perhaps not everything was lost. Perhaps there was still room for rebuilding, even if on completely different foundations. Father's reaction came in the form of a furious phone call that same night. "What do you think you're doing?" he thundered, barely giving me time to respond. "After everything we've done for you, is this how you repay us? By airing family matters to strangers, dragging our name into court." "Family matters?" I repeated, with a calm that momentarily disarmed him. "No, Dad, this isn't just a family matter. It's a question of law, of justice. The house wasn't yours to bestow solely on Ryan. It was part of grandmother, Caroline's inheritance, meant to be shared equally among all her grandchildren. Your grandmother didn't understand the nuances of managing an estate," he exploded. "Ryan is the only one capable of, with all due respect, Dad, Grandmother Caroline built that estate from scratch, while raising 3 children on her own, after Grandpa passed away. I believe she knew a thing or two about management." I paused, allowing my next words to carry the necessary weight. "And as for Ryan's capabilities, it's interesting how you confuse obedience with competence." The silence on the other end was more eloquent than any response he could have offered. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its initial fury, replaced by something perilously close to disappointment. "I never thought you'd betray us like this." "Betrayal?" The word hit me like a slap, and for a moment I faltered. Then I recalled all the times my dreams were dismissed, all the instances when my achievements were minimized, when my existence seemed nothing more than a footnote in our grand family narrative. "No, Dad. Betrayal is what you did to me my entire life. This is just justice arriving, albeit late." The following months were a whirlwind of hearings, mediations, and settlement attempts that felt like emotional minefields. Ryan refused to participate directly, sending only his attorney while, according to Marianne, he spent his days stewing over how I was destroying the family for money. My parents swung between emotional pleas for me to back down and veiled threats about the consequences of my actions. Amid that storm, something unexpected happened. I began to flourish. The confrontation I had feared for so long turned out to be liberating. I no longer cared about being the perfect daughter, the one who never caused trouble, the one who quietly accepted her place in the shadows with a polite smile. I discovered my voice, set my boundaries, and most importantly, recognized my own value. At work, This newfound confidence translated into promotions that had once seemed unattainable. In my personal relationships, I learned to demand the respect I deserved instead of settling for scraps of attention, and most surprisingly, I started to build a genuine relationship with Marianne, not based on predetermined family roles, but on mutual understanding and respect. The final hearing was set for a sunny Tuesday in the spring. I dressed with particular care that day, not to impress or please anyone, but as a silent tribute to the woman I had become through this journey. The navy blue dress, austere yet elegant, was a symbolic armor. I was ready for whatever came next. The judge, a middle-aged man with keen eyes that seemed to see beyond mere words, listened attentively to both sides' arguments. My attorney presented not only my grandmother's will, but also a series of documents showing how the house had been systematically maintained and improved over the years, with resources that belonged to the common inheritance, not just to my parents. When it was my turn to speak, I felt an unexpected calm. "Your Honor, I am not here today for revenge or greed, as the other side suggested. I am here because I believe that justice is not an abstract concept to be molded by convenience. The house in question represents not only a material asset, but the legacy of a woman who believed in equality, even in times when that was hardly common. Grandmother Caroline clearly expressed her wish that this legacy be shared equally among her grandchildren. Honoring that wish is not merely a legal matter, but an honor to her memory and the values she embodied." The verdict came 2 weeks later. The house was to be sold, and the proceeds divided equally among the 3 grandchildren, or alternatively, one grandchild could buy out the other 2 at a fair market value. It was a victory, not only legal, but moral. My family's reaction was a perfect microcosm of the dynamics that had always defined us. Ryan, furious, refused to speak with me, and went on to tell anyone who would listen that I had destroyed our parents' dream. My mother, after several weeks of hurtful silence, sent a message attempting to reconnect, though it was clear she still didn't fully understand why I had caused so much trouble. My father, always too proud to admit any error, chose a silence that I suspected would be long, possibly permanent. Curiously, it was Marianne who proposed a solution no one expected. "What if we bought the house together?" she suggested during one of our increasingly frequent lunches. "I have no interest in living there, but we could renovate it and turn it into something new. Maybe a shelter for women starting over, or a cultural center, something that truly honors Grandmother Caroline." Her proposal took me by surprise, yet it made perfect sense. It was no longer about possessing the house as a trophy of a hard-won battle, but about transforming it into a symbol of renewal and possibility. Ryan, after much initial resistance, eventually agreed to sell his share to the 2 of us, more out of financial necessity than reconciliation, but it was a start. Renovations began in a particularly colorful autumn. The old walls that had witnessed so many painful dynamics were redesigned to create open, welcoming spaces. The living room, where that fateful dinner had taken place, was transformed into a community library. The study where my father had once hidden his secret documents was turned into a free legal advice center for women in vulnerable situations. On a sunny afternoon, while supervising the installation of new, expansive windows designed to let in more light, I discovered an old box hidden in a niche in a wall that had been exposed during the renovations. Inside, I found my grandmother's diaries, yellowed photographs, and unsent letters. In one of them, addressed to my mother but never delivered, Caroline expressed her concern over the unequal treatment she observed among her grandchildren, especially towards me. "Helen, my dear," she had written in her elegant yet firm handwriting, "always remember that a family's true legacy is not in the walls we build, but in the strength and character we nurture in every new member. I see in Beatrice a quiet determination that reminds me so much of myself when I was young. Do not let that flame be smothered by limiting expectations or traditions that no longer serve the purpose of creating whole and happy human beings. The house I built with so much sacrifice is worth nothing if there is no room within it for each person to flourish." Tears came unbidden, not of sadness or resentment, but of deep recognition. My grandmother had truly seen me, even when no one else did, and somehow her strength had reached me across time and silence, guiding me to this moment of rebuilding. 6 months after the renovations, Caroline House, as we decided to call the space, opened its doors. At the inauguration, with Marianne by my side and surprisingly my mother seated in the front row, while my father and Ryan chose not to attend. I spoke not of the painful past, but of the future we were building. "This house," I said, looking at the attentive faces gathered in our freshly landscaped garden, "was once a symbol of division and favoritism. Today it is reborn as a space for acceptance, equality, and new possibilities." Caroline, our grandmother, used to say that a house is not built solely of bricks and mortar, but by the stories we live within it. May the new stories written here be ones of healing, empowerment, and justice. After the ceremony, my mother hesitantly approached me. Her eyes, so much like mine, were brimming with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Perhaps remorse, perhaps reluctant admiration, or a bit of both. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said simply, extending a yellowed envelope. "I found this among your father's things. I thought now was the right time for you to have it." It was a letter from Carolyn, addressed to me, dated just a few weeks before her passing. I saved it to read later, alone, in a moment of quiet that could suitably honor that timeless connection. That night, sitting on the small balcony of my apartment, I finally opened the envelope. The words I found seemed not written in the past, but directly for the woman I had become. "Dear Beatrice," the letter began, "by the time you read these words, I will likely be gone. There are things I need to tell you, truths I couldn't express in life, perhaps out of fear or the belief that time was still on my side. I see in you, even at such a young age, a quiet strength that transcends the limitations others will try to impose on your path. Never let anyone define your worth or dictate the bounds of your potential. The house I built, which I leave as part of my legacy, is not just a property. It is a symbol of all I achieved in a time when they said women could accomplish nothing on their own. I want you to know that regardless of what happens, that same strength resides in you. Use it wisely, with justice, and with the unshakable certainty that your place in the world is determined not by others, but by the courage with which you claim it." I carefully folded the letter, feeling a peace I had never experienced before. The circle was complete. The invisible little girl who once sat at that dinner table, swallowing tears of misunderstanding, had grown into a woman capable not only of fighting for herself, but of transforming a story of exclusion into a legacy of inclusion. The house was no longer a symbol of rejection, but of rebirth, and I was no longer defined by what had been denied to me, but by what I had achieved. Not by those who had rejected me, but by those who had truly seen me. Not by the place they tried to assign me, but by the space I created for myself to flourish. Gazing at the stars that night, I whispered a silent thank you to my grandmother Caroline, whose strength had somehow crossed generations to find me exactly when I needed it most. And I promised her, and myself, that the legacy of strength, justice, and determination would live on, not only in the newly renovated walls of the house that now bore her name, but in every life that would be transformed within it. The next morning, I awoke with a different feeling. It was as if a weight I had carried for years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel guilty for prioritizing my own happiness, for having confronted my family and demanded what was rightfully mine. As I prepared my coffee, I reflected on how that fateful family dinner had become the turning point that changed everything. Marianne called early that morning, her upbeat voice resonating through the phone. "Beatrice, you won't believe it. 3 women have already signed up for the Caroline House Shelter program. The social services folks said our project is exactly what the community needs." I smiled, feeling a satisfaction that went far beyond a legal victory. "That's wonderful, Marianne. When can we meet them?" "They're arriving next week. And there's more." She hesitated for a moment. "Mom volunteered to help with the literacy program we're starting." That information caught me off guard. Helen, the very woman who for years had upheld the system of favoritism that hurt me so deeply, now wanted to be part of the new chapter we were writing. The irony was that in some way it made sense. My mother had always been a follower of traditions, of Dad's expectations, of societal conventions. Perhaps now, seeing her daughters lead something meaningful, she would finally find the courage to follow a different path. "She can come on Thursday," I replied, after a brief moment of thought. "Let's see how it goes." My reunion with my mother was far less dramatic than I had imagined. She arrived punctually, dressed in a simplicity I had never associated with her, always so preoccupied with appearances. Her eyes scanned the newly transformed space with a mixture of nostalgia and admiration. "You've completely transformed this place," she remarked, lightly touching the freshly painted wall. "Your grandmother would have loved it." "I hope so," I replied, still maintaining a certain emotional distance, but without hostility. "Come, let me show you the library we set up." As we walked through the rooms, I realized that my mother now appeared smaller, more fragile than the imposing figure I had once known. Or perhaps it was I who had grown, not only in inner strength, but in the ability to see people beyond the roles they once played. "Beatrice," she suddenly said, stopping in the middle of the hallway, "I failed you, not just as a mother, although I probably failed at that too, but as a woman. I allowed outdated traditions to dictate how I treated my own children. I let your father— No, that's not fair. I allowed both of us to create an environment where you never truly felt valued." It wasn't exactly an apology, but coming from Helen, it was more recognition than I had ever expected. I nodded slightly, not responding immediately. Some wounds need more than words to heal completely. "What do you think about starting over?" I finally suggested, not as mother and daughter, but as two women working together for something greater than ourselves. Her eyes welled up, but she quickly composed herself. Old habits die hard. I would like that very much. In the weeks that followed, Caroline House came to life in ways I had never imagined. 6 women, each with her own story of overcoming adversity, began to reside there temporarily as they rebuilt their lives. The literacy program, surprisingly well led by my mother, attracted volunteers from across the city. Marianne managed the administrative aspects with admirable efficiency, revealing talents that might have otherwise remained dormant in our old family dynamic. Ryan maintained his distance, though Marianne occasionally mentioned that he inquired about the project's progress. My father, on the other hand, remained unyielding in his silence. It was painful in a way, yet also liberating. I no longer defined myself by his approval, nor did I allow his absence to diminish the value of what we were building. One particularly eventful afternoon, as I organized a resume writing workshop for the residents, I received an unexpected visit. Dr. Martin, the lawyer who had helped me in the lawsuit, appeared without warning, carrying a thick folder under his arm. "Miss Beatrice," he greeted me in his customary formal tone. "Forgive my intrusion, but I believe this might interest you." The folder contained old documents related not only to the house, but also to other assets that belonged to my grandmother's estate, smaller properties, investments, and a modest business which, according to the records, was still operational, though in questionable condition. "How did you come by this?" I asked, intrigued. "A colleague at the registry noticed certain irregularities in the management of these assets over the years. Knowing about your recent case, he thought you should be aware," he explained. I spent the entire night poring over those documents, uncovering layers of manipulation that went far beyond mere favoritism. My father had systematically diverted resources from my grandmother's estate to benefit Ryan exclusively, using shell companies and manipulated contracts. It was more than favoritism. It bordered on fraud. The discovery left me in a peculiar state of calm. Years ago, I would have been devastated, perhaps even consumed by anger. Now, I looked at those evidences with the clarity of someone who finally understood that the problem was never me. It was an entire system built on crooked foundations. The next morning, I called Marianne. "Marianne, we need to talk about something important. It's not just about the house. It's about all of Grandmother Caroline's legacy." My sister listened intently as I explained the findings. Contrary to my fears, she didn't express surprise or denial. "I always suspected something was off," she confessed, her voice carrying a maturity I had rarely associated with her. "I never understood how the investments for Ryan's future always seemed so grand compared to what was offered to the two of us. What do you think we should do?" I asked, genuinely interested in her perspective. Our partnership at Caroline House had forged a new mutual respect that was completely transforming our relationship. "I think we have to do what's right, Bea. Not for revenge, but for justice. For us. For those hurt by the mismanaged business, and to honor grandmother's memory." The decision to confront my father once again was not taken lightly. I knew it would mean an even deeper, possibly permanent rupture, but I had learned that sometimes we must choose between superficial peace and real integrity. We arranged a meeting at a neutral cafe, away from both Caroline House and my parents' residence. He arrived punctually, his face an emotionless mask that I had inherited, and fortunately learned to overcome. "Thank you for coming," I began, dispensing with unnecessary formalities. "I found something we need to discuss." When I placed the documents on the table, I noticed a nearly imperceptible change in his expression, a brief flicker of acknowledgement quickly replaced by a studied indifference. "I'm not sure what you expect to find in these old papers, Beatrice. I managed your grandmother's assets the best I could under the circumstances," he said. "The circumstances?" I repeated, keeping my voice calm. "Are you referring to the circumstances in which you systematically diverted resources to benefit only one of the heirs, or to the circumstances in which you allowed companies meant to support entire families to decline because they no longer suited your immediate purposes?" My father adjusted his tie with a nervous gesture he rarely displayed. "You don't understand business or estate management. I made tough decisions to preserve what was important." "And what was important? To whom, Dad? To Grandmother Caroline, who built all of this to be divided equally? To the families who depended on those businesses? Or merely to your distorted vision of how a family legacy should be passed on?" The ensuing silence was different from before. Not a silence of power or control, but of someone who felt truly exposed for the first time. "What do you want, Beatrice?" he finally asked, his voice losing its usual firmness. "Justice, transparency, and a complete restructuring of how these assets are managed. Marianne and I have already hired an independent auditor. We're not looking for legal confrontation unless it becomes absolutely necessary." I expected resistance, arguments, perhaps even threats. What I didn't expect was the deep, resigned sigh that escaped him. "You're just like her, you know, Caroline. The same unyielding determination, the same ability to see through appearances." He ran his hand across his face, suddenly seeming much older. "She used to scare me, and you do too." That unexpected confession caught me off guard. Behind years of favoritism and manipulation, was there something as basic as fear? Fear of a strong, unyielding feminine force that questioned established structures and demanded its rightful place? "This isn't about fear, Dad. It's about doing what's right." "Maybe for you," he replied, with a trace of his old arrogance. "For me, it's always been about protecting a legacy in the way I believed was best. And that included deliberately harming your own daughters?" The question hung between us like lead. For the first time, I saw in his eyes something that resembled genuine regret. "I never thought of it that way," he finally admitted. "I believed I was building something that Ryan would carry on, that would keep the family name. I didn't realize what I was destroying in the process." It wasn't an adequate apology, nor did it erase years of pain and exclusion. But it was a beginning, a small acknowledgement that something had been fundamentally wrong in the dynamic he had helped create and perpetuate. "I will cooperate with the audit," he said, gathering the documents with slightly trembling hands. "Not for you or Marianne, but because Caroline deserves for her legacy to be honored correctly." I left that cafe with mixed emotions. There was no miraculous reconciliation, and I didn't expect one. But something had changed. A truth had been exposed, allowing all of us to breathe a little more freely. The following months were filled with intense work. The audit uncovered even more irregularities than we had initially suspected. With my father's reluctant cooperation, we began reorganizing the management of the assets, revitalizing the businesses that could still be saved, and establishing transparent structures to ensure a fair distribution of resources. Ryan, after initial resistance, eventually became involved, not out of altruism, but because he realized that the new structure might legally benefit him without relying on dubious arrangements. His participation was distant and pragmatic, but at least a channel of communication was open. One particularly significant afternoon, while we were reviewing the restructuring of a small factory that had been part of Caroline's empire, I received a call from Caroline House. One of the residents, Louisa, had secured her first formal job after years in a vulnerable situation. Another, Teresa, had finally gained custody of her children following a court case supported by our volunteer attorneys. At that moment, sitting amid papers and spreadsheets that represented a material legacy, I understood that Caroline's true legacy, and now mine, transcended properties and investments. It was about transformation, about creating opportunities where once there were obstacles, about using power not to control, but to empower. "Why are you smiling?" my father asked, coincidentally present at the meeting. Because I finally understand what Grandmother Caroline was trying to teach me through that letter, I replied quietly. He did not need to know all the details of my inner journey. Some things would remain mine alone. On the first anniversary of Caroline House, we organized a celebration that brought together residents, former residents, volunteers, and supporters. The garden, now lush with carefully cultivated flowers, hosted simple yet elegant tables where people from different backgrounds shared their experiences. My mother, now a constant presence in the project, had helped organize every detail with an enthusiasm I had never witnessed in my childhood. Marianne, revealing artistic talents previously untapped, coordinated an exhibition featuring works created during the therapeutic workshops offered to the residents. To my surprise, Ryan made a brief appearance, accompanied by his wife and children. His demeanor still carried a certain tension as we met, but the simple fact that he came represented an opening that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "Nice work," he remarked curtly, surveying the surroundings. "It wasn't what I imagined for this place, but it works." From him, that was practically an admission of surrender. I smiled, without irony. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to Marianne." My father did not attend, and I wasn't surprised. Our relationship had reached a new balance, not based on affection or emotional reconciliation, but on a reluctant respect for the competence I had demonstrated in both restructuring the businesses and creating something new and meaningful. When night fell and the soft garden lights were turned on, I ascended a small makeshift stage to deliver a brief speech. Looking out at the attentive faces, some I knew intimately, others just beginning to be known, I felt an emotion that transcended personal triumph or revenge. A year ago, we embarked on this journey not merely to transform a physical space, but to reimagine what inheritance and legacy truly mean. Caroline, our grandmother, built far more than properties. She built possibilities, and today, I see those possibilities blooming in every story of overcoming, in every small personal victory we witness here. My eyes met those of my mother, then Marianne's, and finally, for a brief moment, Ryan's, who remained at the periphery yet present. The true value of a legacy is not measured by the material assets we leave behind, but by the lives we touch, the opportunities we create, and the courage we inspire in others to find their own voice and path. Today, we celebrate not just a year of Caroline House, but the transformative power that exists in each of us when we decide not to accept the limitations imposed by others, but to create our own terms for living in this world. I raised my glass in a toast that reached beyond the moment in that space. To Caroline, who planted the seeds, to every one of you who makes them bloom, and to the future we continue building together, one brick of dignity and one brick of hope at a time. Later, when most guests had left, and only a small group remained quietly conversing in the garden, Louisa, one of the first residents, approached me. "Miss Beatrice," she began, still using the formal address I had often tried to dissuade her from using, "I'd like to show you something." She extended a small notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. I started writing my story, just as you suggested during that first workshop. It isn't much, but it's mine, and I wanted you to be the first to read it. I accepted the notebook with the respect it deserved. It wasn't just a collection of pages, but an act of courage, a declaration of existence from someone who had been systematically silenced for so long. "It's an honor, Louisa. Thank you for trusting me." That small moment encapsulated everything we had built. Caroline House was no longer just a social project or a form of personal redemption. It was a space where silent stories could finally find their voice, where fragmented identities could be rebuilt with dignity and strength. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I reflected on the journey since that fateful dinner. The pain of exclusion, which once seemed to define me completely, had transformed into something far more powerful: the ability to create inclusion. The anger at injustice had become the determination to effect meaningful change not only in my own life, but in the lives of others. That family dinner, which began as a cruel declaration of exclusion, had ironically become the catalyst for my liberation. The cold words of my father, intended to seal my fate as a supporting character in our family saga, ultimately opened the door for me to become the author of my own narrative. And in that rewritten story, there was no longer room for invisibility or resignation, only the quiet certainty of having finally found my true place in the world and in the process, helped others find theirs too.